The recent return of the Polar Vortex to Chicago gave us temperatures as low as -9 degrees Fahrenheit and a wind chill as cold as -30. Despite the extreme cold, most of our crops are still growing, thanks to our hoop house, cold frames, low tunnels, and Agribon row cover, which I added over some crops on the coldest days. Today I'll show you how our crops held up to the cold, and I'll share our top 8 cold-hardy crops that thrived despite the polar vortex. After years of extending the growing season, I had a pretty good idea of what to expect after the extreme cold. Specifically, I was most concerned about our mustard greens and our chard. And I wasn't surprised to find that we lost some mustard green plants and some chard leaves here in the hoop house. I already removed the handful of mustard green plants that we lost to the cold, but even this survivor lost its larger leaves and still shows signs of stress. And though all of the chard survived, we lost some of the leaves and most of the plants are still a little droopy. Fortunately, everything else in the hoop house is doing well. Now let's take a look at how our plants did in our hinged low tunnels. Though protected by 2 layers, the plants in these beds were more vulnerable to the cold, for one simple reason. These beds don't get nearly as much sun as the hoop house does at this time of year. On December 22nd, the day after the winter solstice, the hoop house got about 2 more hours of sun than the low tunnel in the background, and about 4 more hours than the one in the foreground. This obviously has a big impact on the temperatures inside the structures and the survivability of plants. Temperatures stayed high enough in the hoop house that the soil never froze, but it did freeze in both low tunnels. Knowing this, I planted mostly very cold-hardy crops in the bed with the least sun and was pleased to see that most of them survived the extreme cold, even though the bed was only getting about 1.5 hours of sun per day. Unfortunately, in the other low tunnel, we lost all of our winter red lettuce, which is quite cold-hardy, but needed more than just a few hours of sun per day to survive the extreme cold. The rest of the plants in this bed did survive, however. Fortunately, now that we're past the winter solstice, these 2 beds will get more and more sun every day. And I've already started kale, lettuce, and spinach in the grow room indoors to transplant out into these beds when they get at least 5 hours of direct sun a day, which I think will happen in February. The good news is that most of our crops survived. Now let's take a look at the top 8 cold-hardy crops that did best during the polar vortex. And I'll start with 5 new varieties that we're trying for the first time this year, and we chose specifically for their cold hardiness. The first is Starbor Kale. All of the kale varieties we're growing are cold-hardy, but Starbor Kale really stands out. We're growing it here in the front yard garden under only 1 layer of 4mm plastic that has holes in it. We're also growing it in the hoop house and in the hinged low tunnels, and all of the plants are thriving. We started all of our winter crops in late summer and early fall, and you can find links to where we bought the seeds in the description below. The second cold-hardy crop that thrived during the extreme cold is winter density lettuce, which are growing in a number of locations around the garden, including in a cold frame here on a compost pile. We're growing winter density lettuce in all of the covered beds in the backyard garden, and we haven't lost any of the plants to the cold. The lettuce I'm harvesting is protected by a glass cold frame and 1 layer of 4mm greenhouse film. Though it's growing on top of a compost pile, the pile is not hot and therefore isn't providing additional heat. Given how well it's holding up to the cold, we'll definitely grow winter density lettuce again next winter. The third crop that was unfazed by the cold is red kitten spinach. Spinach is one of our favorite winter crops, and we decided to try red kitten spinach this year based on a recommendation from Johnny's Selected Seeds. We're growing it in the hoop house and in the hinged low tunnels, and we haven't lost a single plant. We like it so much that I started more plants in our grow room to transplant into the garden in midwinter for a late winter, early spring crop. The fourth standout cold-hardy crop is Vit Mache. We've grown Mache for years, and every variety we've ever grown easily survives the winter under cover. But this year I decided to try Vit Mache because it's supposed to be particularly cold-hardy. One indication that it might be is that we're already harvesting a crop that was planted in early autumn. We usually don't start harvesting Mache until late winter. Okay, that's the last of the new cold-hardy varieties that we're growing this year. Now let's continue our top 8 list with crops we've been growing for years. Number 5 on the list is carrots. It's always nice to have something other than greens in the winter garden. Unfortunately, carrots are very cold-hardy. We're growing Danvers half-long carrots in both of our hinged low tunnels, and they're all doing just fine, even with limited sun. We started the carrots in late summer. The sixth crop that shrugged off the polar vortex is Claytonia. Claytonia is another crop that easily survives our winters under cover. If you let some of the plants go to seed in the spring, Claytonia will readily self-sow and you'll only have to buy seeds once. We typically don't harvest Claytonia until late winter. At that time, this bed will be thick with volunteer plants. Seventh on the list of our top cold-hardy crops is red veined sorrel. Red veined sorrel is a perennial that literally produces year-round, winter, spring, summer, and fall, as long as we protect it in winter. It's not my favorite tasting green by itself, but it works well in salads with a mix of other greens. The last of our top 8 cold-hardy crops is dandelion. Dandelion is very nutritious and cold-hardy, and the greens are less bitter during cold weather. Like red veined sorrel, it produces all year round, as long as it's protected in winter. I hope this video gave you a better idea about some of the cold-hardy crops you might be able to grow in your garden into the fall and winter. I'm fairly confident that some of these crops, including Starbor Kale, red kitten spinach, Mache, Claytonia, and carrots, can be grown in climates even a bit colder than ours, under double cover. As we close today, I'll finish my harvest, and I'll show you the names of everything we're still harvesting after temps as low as -9 degrees Fahrenheit. Though protected by 2 layers, the plants in these beds were more vulnerable to the cold for one simple reason. You nut! Don't do that, Oscar.